Before you can start setting up your custom questions, you must have your categories, subcategories, and tags already set up. And this is important because these questions you're creating will directly apply to those categories, subcategories, and tags. And that's going to make a lot more sense as we go through this tutorial. So these custom questions that you're setting up, these are for your product or service providers to answer when they go through and add a product or service to sell on your marketplace. To help you visualize this, let's pull up the Add Product screen. So if I was a vendor on this product marketplace, this is where I would enter all the information about the item I'm wanting to sell. This is also where those custom questions are going to appear so that I, as the vendor, can answer them. And if I were the vendor, I would go through here and enter in all this information, but we'll just skim through here quickly. Here, I would select my category, and these are those categories that the marketplace owner or site admin would have previously set up. So I'll select handbag. And let's scroll down to the very bottom, and here you can see where those custom questions are located. I selected handbag as my category. So the first question is, please select type of handbag. If I click in this field here, I can see my drop-down answer options that I can select from. So I can select crossbody, and I would go through and answer each question. This last question here is a free-form question, so I would enter or type in my answer. So it's asking what condition is the handbag in. I would type in brand new, good, barely used, etc. One thing to note is this text in here, this please select one subcategory, is completely customizable. It doesn't have to say anything. It can be anything you want. So the same thing goes for a service marketplace. So if I go to add service, very, very similar form, I would enter in all this basic information. If I were the service provider, I'd select my category, and then I'd scroll down and answer the custom questions here. So now that you know where those custom questions appear on your marketplace, and you understand that these questions are for your product or service providers to answer, I'm going to move forward and show you how to set up your custom questions in the Questions Builder. To get to your Questions Builder, from the admin dashboard, you'll select Questions Builder from the top menu bar. And the first area you'll want to notice is this section here. When I click on it, I see I've got default, clothing, handbags, and jewelry. These are the different sections where you'll be creating custom questions in. For now, let's focus on default. So in default, any questions that you set up in default will, as it says, by default, will always be asked whenever the vendor's going through and adding their item in the add product form. They're always going to be asked these questions. So there's two ways that you can set up these default questions. If you've got general questions like what is your gender, what is your age, these questions are completely unrelated to the categories. So you can create an open-ended question that will prompt the vendor to manually type in their answer. So let's use the gender question as an example. So to create an open-ended question, you have two options. You can allow the vendor a short open form or a paragraph open form. And since this question is very, it just prompts a short answer, I'll select the text. So when I select that, you'll notice that this field over here populates. When I click on that field, which you'll want to do, this left field here populates. All of my work is going to be done in this left field, and you'll see that it's reflected in this field here. So under label here, under untitled, this is where I'd want to enter my label. So whatever the theme of the question, so I can say gender here. And then this larger section here, that's where I'm going to enter in my question. So what is your gender? And as you see, the label over here populates and the question populates here. And there's a section here where the vendor will be able to manually enter text to answer the question. So you also have the option to make that text field small, medium, or large. Let's say I want it medium. Here's an example of the large. It just extends it. We'll stick with small. And then you'll want to save form. And anytime that you create a new question, you always want to save form. And anytime you want to make any changes, just click on that field there, and this left field will populate, and you can make any edits you need. So this is an example of a general question, open-ended question, where the vendor will manually enter in or type in their answer. So this is an example of a default question. So I'm going to delete this, and to delete any field here, you just click on that red button, and then you'll of course want to save the form. Another example of default questions that you can set up. So if you want to make it really simple for the vendor to go through, select their category, and then select their the subcategories that apply, and select their tags that apply, you can set that up as default as well. Because remember, you already have set up your subcategories to link to some of your categories and your tags to link to some of your subcategories. So if you wanted to make it that way to where the vendor just selects their subcategories, the way you do that is make sure you're in default. And here you'd want to select your linked subcategory. Now the difference between your linked subcategory and your regular subcategory is it's dependent on the category. So in this example here, let's say the vendor goes through while adding their product and they select clothing. If I've set up the questions with linked subcategory, all of those categories or subcategories that are linked to the category clothing will show up as options. If I just set up the question for just subcategories, it won't matter as to which category that the vendor selected. All of the subcategories will show up as options for the vendor to select all that apply. In this case, let's use the linked subcategory. So if I click on linked subcategory, this section here populates. Click on that. Here I'm going to create my label. So the label is going to be subcategories. And the question will be, not necessarily a question, but to prompt the vendor, and say, please select all subcategories that apply. And then down here, I'll see all the different subcategories that apply. Now remember, I selected linked subcategories, so it's very dependent on what the vendor, which category the vendor chose. So if they chose, let's say clothing, only those subcategories linked to clothing will show up. However, in your view, obviously the vendor hasn't selected anything, so all of those options are going to be there. Now, you want to save the form, and now you want to move on to tags. So you want to do the link tag. So select link tags, and here you'll see that it automatically populates on top of your previous question. That's okay. I'll show you how to change the order. So when I click on that, here I'm going to add the label. So I'm going to put in tags. Here I'll say, please select all tags that apply. And here I can see all of those tag options. And then I'll want to click on Save Form. And if I want to change the order, all you have to do is simply grab one of the sections and pull it over. And that'll change the order. And of course, if you change the order, you save form. Another thing I want to bring up is if I click on here, whenever the way that these drop-down options are viewed is you can make it to where it defaults to blank. So whenever the vendor goes through and selects their all the tags that apply, the first thing they'll see is a blank. Otherwise, Otherwise, the first option that they'll see will be dress, or whichever option according to the category that they have. So if you want them to see like a blank field, include the blank there. Save form. And as you see, this is what I mean, shows a blank instead of showing every single option or defaulting. So here it defaults to business casual. If I click on that and click on include blank, it blanks it out. We'll save form. So those are examples of how you can set up default questions so that they're always asked regardless of which category the vendor chooses when they're going through and adding their item. Another way to set up your questions is if you have a particular set of questions that you only want to ask per particular category, you can set those up in each one of these category sections. So for example, if your vendor was going through and adding an item and they selected clothing, only those questions that you create under the section clothing will appear for them to answer. Same thing goes for handbags. If they were to select the category handbags, only those questions that you created for the category handbags in that section will be asked from the vendor. So let's look at some examples. So if we go to clothing, the first thing you're probably going to want to think is what follow-up questions or what questions are you going to want to ask the vendor after they select the category clothing. So you probably are going to ask, what is the garment type? Are they selling a dress? Are they selling a shirt? So that can be your very first question. So you have to think about like your subcategories, and that's always a good place to start. So if you click on linked subcategories here, we've got this blank space here. If we click on that, we see our workspace here. And here we see all of our options, all of our subcategory options. So like I said, we're going to ask, what is the garment type? And we want to think about the way that the vendor's going to answer. Here in our subcategories, we've got some available answer options. So oftentimes you will notice that a lot of your subcategories and even your tags will apply as possible answer options. So let's create our question. And again, we're creating the question under the section clothing. So only the questions that I create here will only be asked if the vendor selects clothing as their category when they go through and add their item. So let's create a label. We said garment type. And then we'll create our question. What is the garment type? So then the next thing you'll want to do is, if you want to make this question required, which most likely you probably will, you'll want to make sure that this check mark is selected right here by required. If you want to unselect it, it won't be a requirement. They'll be able to add the item without having to answer the question. Let's leave it as required for now. And then after you create your question, you'll want to eliminate the subcategories that don't apply as answer options to this question. So if I'm asking what is the garment type, it's probably unlikely that the vendor's going to select earrings, right? So let's eliminate earrings, bracelet, anything that doesn't have to do with a garment type. So all these handbags. Here we go. We've got shirts, shorts, skirts, pants, and dress. Those can be the options, and those do apply as answer options to this question. So we can also include a blank. And of course, always save form after you create questions. What's the next question we could ask? Could we ask maybe something that had to do with any of our tags? Could any of our tags be possible answer options? Let's take a look. So we'll click on linked tags. We'll click in here, and here's our workspace. So what's the next question we could ask looking at these tags? Maybe the material of the garment. I see some material options here. We could maybe ask like the style, like business casual, cocktail party. Let's go with material. So I'm going to create the label. That'll be material. Here our question will be, what material is the garment made from? And then we will unselect anything in our tags that doesn't apply as a possible answer option for material. So we've got silk, satin, those are materials. Rose gold isn't really. Patent leather, leather, gold, Denim is a material, cotton, costume, and we'll leave these as options. We'll want to include a blank, and then we'll save form. Now, another question we can ask is probably about the style. So again, you'd go to your linked tag, click in there, open up your workspace here, create a label. So this one's going to be style. We'll create our question here. What style is the garment? And you can also prompt the vendor or the product provider to answer with multiple options. So you can give them the option to choose all that apply. And the way you'd want to prompt them is just including that in your question. So choose all that apply. And then we'll deselect anything that doesn't have to do with style. Vintage is a style. Formal is a style. Costume can be a style, casual and business casual, and we'll include that blank. And then we'll save a form. And then you can also create open form type questions that would prompt the vendor to answer by typing in their question. So to do that, you select text, click in here, create a label. So it's something that we could maybe do like the condition. If you've got kind of like a secondhand type of store, you can do just have them describe the item if you'd like. Here we'll just do condition. So we can say, what is the condition of the garment? And we can prompt them to only type in certain ones. So we can do good, bad, barely worn, perfect condition. And we can say type your answer. And you can make the answer section small, medium, or large. We'll go with medium here. And then we'll save form. And then again, you can also change up the order of how these questions are asked. So if I want garment type to be asked first, and then material, and then style, and then condition, I can set it up that way. I'll click on Save Form. And that's the way to do it by each section. So if I go to, let's say, handbags, it's going to be blank because I haven't created any questions in there. If I wanted to create a question, we could go to linked subcategory. All of my subcategories are going to show up. Let's create a label. What could be a good question for handbags? Maybe like the handbag style. So what is the style of the handbag? And here we can deselect anything that doesn't have to do with a style of handbag. So clutch is a style, wristlet, crossbody, tote, shirts, shorts, skirts, pants, and dress are not. We'll include a blank here. Click on Save Form, and then you'd continue to go on and add any other specific questions that you want to ask that pertain to the category handbag. And then you'd go on and do the same for each one of your category sections here in your questions builder. So let's take a look at what these questions look like now that we've set them up. Now let's take a look at what those custom questions that we set up look like. So I signed in as a new user, Tanya. She wants to be a vendor on this site. So we're going to go to the Add Product form here. If she were to select clothing, let's scroll to the bottom. Yep, she would have to answer all of these custom questions that we just created. What is the garment type? If we click in here, those are our answer options, and so on. Now let's take a look at handbags, because we also did a question for handbags. So if she were to select handbags, she would have to answer this custom question here, select from these answer options. So now you have an understanding that you can create custom questions under the default section in your questions builder, meaning that regardless of what category the vendor chooses, those same questions, those default questions will always appear. And you also understand now that you can create custom questions per each section in your questions builder for each category. So you can have a different set of questions for each category. So now that you have an understanding of how the questions builder works and where those custom questions show up for your vendor, you can go forward and create your own custom questions for your marketplace.